Welcome, Corey. Thanks for being here. The Miami College Republicans. Hey, Joel from Spectrum. Great to be here.
Can you scroll?
Hey, Caleb from OAC. We got Anna from
Spectrum and FIDE. Okay, we're good. Thank you.
Awesome. Melissa is here from Troublemakers. I really wish that I could sing, so I could have joined that organization in undergrad, but I definitely cannot. Dave, Green Gamers, lots of organizations here. Here for Red Brick Rewards. That's wonderful. Of course, interested to learn. Love to hear that. We have Shams. Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. It's so helpful to know who I have in the room, what experiences are out there, and some of these organizations I might have heard of before since I'm new. So thank you so much for doing that. And like I said, welcome. If at any point, please feel free to throw any questions you have in the chat. But thank you all for being here this afternoon. So we're going to go ahead and get started to the content. So here's my first task for you is to help me understand, like, what is public speaking? How would you all define what public speaking is, or what does that mean to you? So feel free to unmute yourself if you're comfortable, or just throw your ideas in the chat. What is public speaking? What does that mean? Sharing your ideas with a group of people. Yep. Speaking in front of an audience in public. Absolutely. Speaking in front of a body of people. Yep. Absolutely. Y'all pretty much nailed it, right? It doesn't seem like a very difficult concept or term, but public speaking is the process of speaking to a group of people, like you all mentioned, in a structured, deliberate manner intended to inform, influence, or entertain the audience. So a few key words there I'd like to point out, because you all nailed speaking in front of a group of people, right? But want to mention that, it is pretty structured. Usually it's deliberate because your intention is to inform somebody about maybe your organization's mission or values, or maybe you're entertaining them, right? But there is always intent behind the content that you are giving to your audience. So the goal, right, is to deliver value to your organization members. Or maybe it's at an event and you're gearing that event towards potential new members of your organization, right? So there is always a goal, and that is to deliver value to your audience members. And a good rule of thumb that I like to remind everyone of is that public speaking or presenting is not about you as the facilitator or presenter. It's about them. It's about the audience. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as you are facilitating or public speaking, right? So it's not about you, it's about them. So next up, who are public speakers? So once again, unmute yourself or just throw it in the chat. Who do you consider public speakers? Anyone? Good. Yeah. Anyone? Perfect. Well, y'all are too smart for this because yes, absolutely. You may see some familiar faces up there, but yeah, anyone can be a public speaker, including you. So we often think of public speakers as maybe political figures, right? Actors such as my pal Leo right there on the left, even talk show hosts or comedians, and university officials, right? Like our own Dr. Crawford, and that includes professors and staff members, right? And last but not least, you. So y'all nailed it, pretty much anyone, the president, right? I see a few things in the chat, and everyone just at different times. Yeah, absolutely. So you can definitely be a public speaker, and you are, right? Especially when you're leading organization meetings or leading organization events. So absolutely. So the next thing we want to talk about is the cornerstones to solid presentations. And there are a few things here that I want to be sure that we chat through. So first and foremost, it's really important to know yourself. And what we mean by that is knowing your specific style, right? Your facilitation style, how you like to facilitate meetings or events or lead those things. Everyone is different. If you are like me, you like to be well prepared, know pretty much exactly what you would like to say, and have notes to the side like I do. You just can't see them here. And have notes so that you know what you'd like to say. And if you stumble a little bit, you can look to them. Other people, and I can't relate to these people, I wish I could, but they are just on the fly, right? Like they don't need notes, they got it, they can just do their thing and present without any notes or maybe little preparation. And so everybody has a different style. And so when I'm going through this presentation, I encourage you to kind of reflect on what your style is. Additionally, everyone has a different set of skills, strengths, and weaknesses. So it's really important that we are self-aware enough to know where our skills are and what strengths and weaknesses we do have, so that we can continue to work on those as we practice when we are leading or in front of people, right? So for example, I'll give you some of my weaknesses and you might have already picked up on them in this presentation. One of my weaknesses is that I say or pretty often, right? And I'm trying not to say it now, but it is a space filler for me. So even though I know maybe what I'm going to say next, if there's a break in my sentences, I tend to say or and that's very normal, very natural. A lot of people do that, or they say like, right? So that is something that I recognize in myself when I am presenting and try really hard to avoid that. One of my other weaknesses or pet peeves of my own that I do is I use my hands a lot. So if you see my hands popping up in the screen, you'll notice that I try really hard to keep them at bay, but it can be very difficult. But I do think that they can be distracting. So I try not to, if I'm in a virtual meeting, I try not to show them on screen as often, or if I'm in person, I try not to use them as much. So really important to understand your strengths and weaknesses because we all have them. So just take a moment to kind of reflect on what you think your strengths and weaknesses are as a presenter or as a public speaker, if you will. I'm not going to have you share those. Those are for your own thoughts. The next thing that I want you to think about is knowing your material. Now, if you're leading an organization meeting, this might be easy, right? Because you know your organization the best. You're a member or a leader of that organization, and so you should know the content. But if you're presenting on something that you're not as familiar with, it really is important to do some good research, right? And make sure that you understand what you're telling your audience before you tell them, right? Because we should always be expecting questions from our audience members. And if we're not prepared to answer those, then it's not going to be fun for you as the presenter because you may not know or have all the answers. So definitely be sure to do your research ahead of time if you are presenting on content that you may not be as familiar with. And that's the same for any statistics that you want to include or data, right? Just making sure that you fully understand any numbers or research that you are wanting to present to your audience. I feel like this is especially important, especially in like class facilitations, but for student org stuff, hopefully you know the content and the material, but if not, make sure you do your research ahead of time. And make sure you practice that content, right? So if it's content that you're not familiar with, making sure you practice that. I have given a version of this presentation a few times now, and it's always different, but I always practice just in case. And so that's something that I like to do. And again, practicing could look different for everybody, but especially if you are giving new content to folks, making sure that you are practicing that new material so you know how you want to say it when you are presenting to your members. Knowing your audience is the next cornerstone. Again, this may seem relatively easy because you will hopefully know the members of your organization, but maybe your organizations are really large and you don't know some of the newer members. So maybe you need to get to know them in order to know your audience a little bit better as an organization leader. Now, their age will be easy, right? They should ideally be college age students, so anywhere from 18, 17, maybe even to 22 or 23. And they probably have similar knowledge base to you if they're in your same organization, but you never want to assume, of course. So just making sure that you understand where your audience is at in their knowledge of the content that you are presenting. I feel like this is especially true if you're hosting an event for people outside of your organization, right? So this could be parents, maybe this is for non-members. It's really important that you understand who is going to be coming to the event so that you know who your audience is. And finally, it's important that you understand your overall purpose. So of course, there's a purpose for your audience member to be in attendance, right? Maybe they're an organization member and they're there because it's your weekly meeting, or maybe just because they're interested in your event, so they're there. But your event or your meeting will always have a purpose. And it's really important that you know what that purpose is, right? So the goal of this workshop, this facilitation, is for you all to understand facilitation skills, right? That's the overall goal. It's important that you know what you hope your audience members get out of the presentation, so that way you can align your presentation as such, right? So making sure that you know what you hope your audience gets out of that presentation or content so that you can deliver the content better or more clear. And don't forget that overall purpose, right? There could be times where maybe your organization meetings get derailed by different conversations, and that's okay, right? But always make sure that you're coming back to the event's overall purpose. And that's something that you should hopefully be establishing either with other leaders or other members of your organization. So those are the 4 cornerstones of presentations. I will pause here in case there are any questions about any of that material. So please feel free to, once again, throw them in the chat or shout them out. Always want to give space for you all to do that. All right, seeing and hearing none, we will move on. So here are 3 different parts to a presentation, and you may be thinking, Alyssa, beginning, middle, end. We're in college now. I understand what those concepts are, and you are very right. These are very elementary school concepts. However, it is important to recognize these things in a presentation or a meeting or a facilitation that you're giving. So in the beginning of a presentation, it usually is pretty safe, right? And by that, I mean, it's very low stakes. You're just warming up at this point. So for example, I had asked you all to just throw in the chat your name and the organization you were representing, right? Like very low stakes. That should be easy for most folks to do. Maybe in the beginning, you also have your chapter members do an icebreaker or something similar, right? So your chapter or organization members are getting to know one another. So very low stakes in the beginning. And the reason why you want to start that way is because the middle can be very hardy depending on the content that you're presenting to them, right? So we suggest that the middle of your presentation or your content or your meeting does provide some good variety and balance and good pacing. And so by those things, we mean, switch it up. In this presentation, unfortunately, I'm going to be talking to you all a lot, but that's why I ask for your feedback every so often, right? Like throw in the chat or unmute yourself. Later on, we're going to be watching a video. So we're going to be switching the content up a little bit so that members stay engaged in what we're saying. We also encourage you to have good pacing. I could probably read this presentation to you all, if I'm being honest, in 15 minutes, if I were to just whip through the entire presentation. But you probably, you might not understand a lot of the concepts if I did that because I was going too quickly, right? So it's important that you're pacing yourself and really making sure you're giving your members or your audience time to digest the material that you're giving them. Being flexible is also really important. Things don't always go to plan. We know that now, especially in COVID times. So we just always encourage you all to be flexible in your meetings. Like I said, I am someone who likes to be prepared, likes to have a plan. Maybe you have an agenda. But if things are kind of going off course for your agenda, that's okay. Just be flexible and know that you can always come back to something that you were chatting about, just making sure that it's tied back into your overall goals and purpose of that program or event, right? Tying it back to the 4 cornerstones. And then finally, there's an end, right? Eventually your meeting will end, eventually the program will end. And this time is really important for a few things. First of all, you always, want to share your gratitude for your members showing up to the meetings or audience members attending a really awesome program. So making sure you're doing some gratitude there, but also evaluating the presentation, right? Maybe this is a time where you can ask your members or your audience to share some feedback with you all about how it went, or of course, ask any questions that they had. So sometimes we forget that to leave some time at the end for questions, but make sure that you're doing that. So again, if there's any confusion about the content that you presented at your meeting or your program, that people have the chance to ask those questions. So very important. So as I mentioned, very elementary school concept, but some important notes for each section when it comes to actually presenting. So what we're going to do now is talk about the gold standard. And when we talk about public speaking, a few things often come to mind. For me, TED Talks come to mind, and I'm hopeful that many of you have at least seen a TED Talk or heard of a TED Talk. But to me, that has always been like the gold standard of public speaking, right? I always think of these folks as the experts in their field, and so they must be an expert facilitator or speaker. And so while TED Talks aren't, the end all be all, they do give us some good material to work with. So I do want us to watch this TED Talk. It's called The Secret to Great Public Speaking. And I am going to ask you some just reflection questions at the end, but I do think this is a great video to learn more about the ins and outs of TED Talks and why we do think of them as the gold standard. So I am going to play this. If at any point you cannot hear it, please let me know and I will adjust. If I could just get a thumbs up if we can hear this.
Some people think that there's a TED Talk formula. Give a talk on a round red rug, share a childhood story, divulge a personal secret, end with an inspiring call to action. No, that's not how to think of a TED Talk. In fact, if you overuse those devices, you're just going to come across as cliched or emotionally manipulative. But there is one thing that all great TED Talks have in common, and I would like to share that thing with you. Because over the past 12 years, I've had a ringside seat listening to many hundreds of amazing TED speakers like these. I've helped them prepare their talks for prime time and learn directly from them their secrets of what makes for a great talk. And even though these speakers and their topics all seem completely different, they actually do have one key common ingredient. And it's this. Your number one task as a speaker is to transfer into your listeners' minds an extraordinary gift, a strange and beautiful object that we call an idea. Let me show you what I mean. Here's Haley. She is about to give a TED Talk, and frankly, she's terrified. Over the course of 18 minutes, 1,200 people, many of whom have never seen each other before, are finding that their brains are starting to sync with Haley's brain and with each other. They're literally beginning to exhibit the same brainwave patterns. And I don't just mean that they're feeling the same emotions. There's something even more startling happening. And let's take a look inside Haley's brain for a moment. There are billions of interconnected neurons in an impossible tangle. But look, here, right here, a few million of them are linked to each other in a way which represents a single idea. And incredibly, this exact pattern is being recreated in real time inside the minds of everyone listening. That's right. In just a few minutes, a pattern involving millions of neurons is being teleported into 1,200 minds just by people listening to a voice and watching a face. But wait, what is an idea anyway? Well, you can think of it as a pattern of information that helps you understand and navigate the world. Ideas come in all shapes and sizes, from the complex and analytical to the simple and aesthetic. And here are just a few examples shared from the TED stage. Sir Ken Robinson, creativity is key to our kids' future.
My contention is that creativity now is as important in education as literacy. and we should treat it with the same status.
Laura Harding, building from bamboo is beautiful.
It is growing all around us. It's strong, it's elegant, it's earthquake resistant.
Chimamanda Adichie, people are more than a single identity.
The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete.
Your mind is teeming with ideas, and not just randomly. They're carefully linked together. Collectively, they form an amazingly complex structure that is your personal worldview. It's your brain's operating system. It's how you navigate the world. And it is built up out of millions of individual ideas. So, for example, if one little component of your worldview is the idea that kittens are adorable, then when you see this, you'll react like this. But if another component of your worldview is the idea that leopards are dangerous, then when you see this, you'll react a little bit differently. So it's pretty obvious why the ideas that make up your worldview are crucial. You need them to be as reliable as possible, a guide to the scary but wonderful real world out there. Now, different people's worldviews can be dramatically different. For example, how does your worldview react when you see this image?
What do you think when you look at me? A woman of faith, an expert, maybe even a sister, or oppressed, brainwashed, a terrorist?
Whatever your answer, there are millions of people out there who would react very differently. So that's why ideas really matter. If communicated properly, they're capable of changing forever how someone thinks about the world and shaping their actions both now and well into the future. Ideas are the most powerful force shaping human culture. So if you accept that your number one task as a speaker is to build an idea inside the minds of your audience, here are 4 guidelines for how you should go about that task. 1, limit your talk to just one major idea. Ideas are complex things. You need to slash back your content so that you can focus on the single idea you're most passionate about and give yourself a chance to explain that one thing properly. You have to give context, share examples, make it vivid. So pick one idea and make it the through line running through your entire talk so that everything you say links back to it in some way. 2, give your listeners a reason to care. Before you can start building things inside the minds of your audience, you have to get their permission to welcome you in. And the main tool to achieve that? Curiosity. Stir your audience's curiosity. Use intriguing, provocative questions to identify why something doesn't make sense and needs explaining. If you can reveal a disconnection in someone's worldview, they'll feel the need to bridge that knowledge gap. And once you've sparked that desire, it will be so much easier to start building your idea. 3, build your idea piece by piece out of concepts that your audience already understands. You use the power of language to weave together concepts that already exist in your listeners' minds, but not your language, their language. You start where they are. The speakers often forget that many of the terms and concepts they live with are completely unfamiliar to their audiences. Now, metaphors can play a crucial role in showing how the pieces fit together because they reveal the desired shape of the pattern based on an idea that the listener already understands. For example, when Jennifer Kahn wanted to explain the incredible new biotechnology called CRISPR, she said, "It's as if for the first time you had a word processor to edit DNA. CRISPR allows you to cut and paste genetic information really easily." Now, a vivid explanation like that delivers a satisfying aha moment as it snaps into place in our minds. It's important, therefore, to test your talk on trusted friends and find out which parts they get confused by. 4, here's the final tip. Make your idea worth sharing. By that, I mean, ask yourself the question, who does this idea benefit? And I need you to be honest with the answer. If the idea only serves you or your organization, then I'm sorry to say it's probably not worth sharing. The audience will see right through you. But if you believe that the idea has the potential to brighten up someone else's day, or change someone else's perspective for the better, or inspire someone to do something differently, then you have the core ingredient to a truly great talk, one that can be a gift to them and to all of us.
Awesome. So while I do recognize that not all of us will go on to be TED Talk speakers, maybe I do have some future TED Talkers in the room, I do want us to just reflect a little bit on just some of the basic principles that he touched on in the video. So I am going to ask if you would like to share to put it in the chat. But what overall did you take away from this? What were some of your main takeaways from the video? Again, if there are some brave folks in the room, feel free to unmute yourself as well, but the chat works too. What are your main takeaways from this video? Keep everything related to one idea. Yeah, good. I think that was pretty much right off the bat what he said. Was your number one task is to transfer to your audience one idea, right? Give people a reason to care. Yeah, yep, absolutely. Good. Did you see in any way ways that this video connected to some of the content that we've already discussed here in this presentation? So any connections that you made between this video and what I've presented to you? And Caleb did say, reflecting on difficult concepts of the speech to ensure you aren't losing your audience. Yep, absolutely. So avoiding giving too much content, sticking to one idea. Yep, absolutely. So we talked about that in the cornerstones, right? Like always making sure that we're coming back to our main goal or purpose, right? So that relates to that sticking to one idea concept, right? Awesome. Thank you. Do you see at all how you might apply some of these lessons to your organization meetings or programs or events? So how can you relate to some of this content? How can you use some of this content as a student leader or a student organization member? Not overwhelming the group by giving too much information at once, highlight the important things. Yeah, absolutely, Melissa. Thank you for sharing that. I think sometimes, especially in maybe some of our organization meetings, we have so much to go over and so much to cover, right? And there are just so many things that we need to get done or talk about, but instead we might lose out on some really great conversations about maybe one particular thing, right? Because we're trying to cram too much into the program. Yeah. Incorporating the 4 cornerstones into your presentation planning overall. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love explicitly mentioning them too. And these are all concepts that you can take back to your organization, right? So hopefully at the end, I know the SEALs were gathering some emails. So if y'all are interested, I could always send these materials out as well. So awesome. Thank you so much for sharing and participating and engaging. Really appreciate that. But we will move on to our next concept. So we're going to talk just a little bit about style tips and tricks for you all as presenters, as facilitators, and these are some of my favorites. So first and foremost, stay focused and stay on time as a facilitator, right? So I like to use the idea that no one is mad if your class gets out 5 minutes early, right? But everyone is mad if you get out 1 minute late, right? So make sure that you are using your time efficiently and effectively so that you respect your chapter members or audience members' time, right? So stay focused, stay on time. The next one is watch your jargon, abbreviations, or filler words. So jargon and abbreviations kind of go hand in hand. So jargon is anything that might make sense to you all or you as chapter leaders, but might not be so easily digestible for maybe some of your general organization members or a new member of your organization, right? So try to avoid those. And if you are using them, explain them as you go, right? That's especially true for abbreviation. So if you're using a new abbreviation, make sure that you say it fully once, and then you can explain that abbreviation and then use the abbreviation later. That's totally fine. We're just making sure that everyone is on the same page about what you're talking about. The next is filler words, and I already clocked myself for using earlier in the presentation, and I know that I continue to do that, but the concept is that it's not too distracting, right? So if I was saying every 2 seconds, that would definitely be distracting, but hopefully it's less distracting because it's further apart. So just be cognizant of when you're using filler words, and that comes with practice, right? Which practice like you mean it is the next tip. So everyone practices differently. To me, I always find it helpful not to just like read over the content multiple times, but actually practice it out loud. I don't necessarily mean like in front of a mirror, but maybe just to yourself. Out loud definitely helps. So try to do that, especially if you're facilitating on content that you may not be as confident about. And then if you have a co-facilitator or a co-presenter, I highly recommend that you practice with them because again, everyone has their own presentation style and it's really important for you both to understand how you kind of play off of each other, right? So especially if you have a second presenter or even a third presenter that you're practicing with them as well. The next one is eye contact and moving around the space. So making sure that you're paying attention to your audience when they are speaking is really important, and moving around to keep their attention. Now that's very difficult on a Zoom meeting, right? I'm very much so static because I got nowhere to go, and you wouldn't be able to see me. So moving around in a space can be helpful, especially if you have a larger audience. So that way they keep their attention on you. But also don't be weird about this, right? Like it can also be very distracting. So you don't need to be sprinting back and forth or anything, but just in a casual way so that it seems more natural to keep people engaged. Always encourage sharing in your meetings, especially, and be prepared to invite people to do that. Even if you didn't plan for sharing in that particular section of a presentation, right? If people have folks to say, they're raising their hand, I definitely encourage you to take those questions or take that feedback in the moment because you might forget when you get to the end of the presentation, right? So that's why I've always encouraged you all to share your thoughts in the chat, raise your hand, whatever it may look like for you and your organization, but definitely encourage sharing and participation for sure. So it's not just you all talking at them. The next is that your nonverbals matter, right? So if I was sitting here in this presentation and I was like, here's some tips and tricks, and I was maybe looking down and it looked like I was on my phone or something, that might signal to you all that I don't care about this presentation or this workshop, right? And that is not the case. So it's really important that you're also focusing on your nonverbals and what you're putting out to your audience non-verbally. Particularly watch this if you're co-facilitating, right? So we talked about practicing if you have someone next to you or with you, and if it's not your turn to speak, don't be distracted by your phone because you might miss your cue to then say your next line or whatever the case may be, right? So it's really important that your nonverbals matter, and definitely ask your audience to do the same, right? Like in the beginning, I asked you to remove distractions and I removed my distractions. So we're all on the same page, but your nonverbals definitely matter. Dress and appearance, I'm not going to touch on this one too much. There's a lot out there about professionalism, right? I always go with, wear what you are comfortable with presenting in, right? Professionalism looks so different for everybody. And so it's hard to really define, but go with what you are comfortable with. If your organization is cool with shorts and a t-shirt because it's hot out, like that's cool, right? Doesn't matter so much. Just go with what you're comfortable with and what you feel is appropriate for that particular moment. And then finally, I always like to put in this little note on humor because y'all have been in this world for at least 18 years now. I have been in this world for 26 years old, 26 years, I'm 26 years old. And at this point in your life, if you are funny. And let me tell you, I know that I'm not funny. So I do not use humor or try to use humor in my presentations because I know it's not going to work, right? If you're funny, you like to do some stand-up, please incorporate those into your presentations. But sometimes, we all have maybe that one professor who just tries to be funny and it's just not. And then it just kind of gets weird and uncomfortable, right? So if you know you're funny, use it. If you're not, right? And that also, another note about that, and everyone's humor is different. So just be careful if you are using humor, right? We never want to distract from the presentation, but also we don't want to offend anybody with our humor if it differs from somebody else's, right? So just a quick note on humor there. But questions about style tips and tricks before I move forward? All right. So the next thing that I have for you is the art of reflection. And by this, I mean asking good questions. So like I said, a good tip is to encourage your members to share throughout your event or presentation or program, right? And so for this, I do recommend that you ask one question at a time. It can be overwhelming if you're spewing out 5 different questions to your audience at a time. They may be confused. So definitely ask one question at a time. And if you do want to ask multiple questions, just do them afterwards, right? The next thing is to be patient and give them time to think. I think this one is the hardest for me because I hate silence. It makes me very uncomfortable. And in class, I would always be the one to break silence because I couldn't take more than like 30 seconds of it. So maybe some of you all can relate to that in some of your Zoom classes last year. But as a facilitator, as a presenter, it is important to be comfortable in silence, right? That's especially true if you're presenting on Zoom, where you may be using the chat feature more often and you're waiting for some answers to come in. We saw that today, right? So just be patient. And if you need to, you can prompt people, right? You can respond to the question yourself to maybe get others more comfortable in responding to your question, but just be patient. The responses will come because there will be someone like me who hates the silence and will end up breaking it for you. But to that, I do say ask open-ended questions so it's easier for them to respond. So, you know, this can be hard if you're not prepared ahead of time to ask these questions. So if you do want to solicit some good responses from your members or your audience, make sure that you prepare those ahead of time. And I usually encourage people to ramp up, and what by that I mean start with easier questions and then dive deeper, especially if you're talking about maybe a difficult topic in an organization meeting or a topic that you've never discussed before. Always ask with some easier, more low stakes questions before you ramp up to some of those difficult questions that you want your audience members to answer. I already mentioned this, but lead the way if necessary, right? Like if the silence becomes too long, you can always break it yourself to encourage people to answer your questions. And then finally, mix it up. I've tried to emulate this in the session today, but use different features, use the chat. You can use breakout rooms if you're in a Zoom. I didn't make you do that today. You're welcome. Use individual reflections, right? Have people write individual reflections down, pair and share. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can kind of mix this up and get your audience members engaging in the content that you are presenting. With that, we also encourage you to listen and incorporate, right? So as your audience members are answering your questions, listen for themes, right? Observe what they're saying and how they're saying it, because that'll give you some really great information on the topic at hand. Use people's names, this is especially true if you have a larger organization and you may have a lot of newer members. So using people's names when they respond can be really helpful so that everyone can get to know who they are and remember their name. And then practice active listening, right? Once again, even if you're not speaking, make sure you're not distracted so that you can remember what that person said, can reiterate that, right? And then move on with your presentation. So make sure that you're active listening to them so their voices are heard as well. And then the last thing that I have for you all before we wrap up is just some basic facilitation do's and don'ts. So we've talked about some of these concepts already, but do prepare with other organization leaders. So I mentioned having a co-facilitator. Maybe your co-facilitator is another organization leader. It's really important that you both are on the same page as to what your goals are for that presentation, right? So make sure that you're preparing with them if that's the case. Don't pass judgment on your organization or audience members, right? So if they ask a question that you might think is silly, right? Don't judge them for that, and definitely don't call them out in that way. Make sure that they feel heard and answer their question appropriately, right? Without passing judgment on them. Do pay attention to who is participating and who isn't. I feel like this is especially important. There may be some organization members who are always active and always willing to share, and that's great. We love those members, but it's also important to be engaging with those members who may not share as much, right? Maybe you notice that someone isn't sharing as much, so maybe you are able to connect with them outside of that event space, right? And connect with them and see what's going on. And maybe they're just someone who doesn't like to share outwardly, and that's okay too. But paying attention to this can really give you some great insight for your organization. And with that, I will say, like, don't target specific people who aren't sharing, right? Don't target them in that specific moment. No one likes being called out in class, right, by a professor. So I definitely don't encourage that in an organization meeting or an event. It just isn't great for that one individual, right, and can be very embarrassing. So I don't recommend doing that in your meetings. So some quick do's and don'ts there. So I threw a lot at you this afternoon, and I recognize that it's a lot of content, but hopefully you took some pieces that you can bring back to your student organizations. We talked about public speaking a little bit, the 4 cornerstones and elements of a presentation, talked about the gold standard a little bit, and TED Talks. Hopefully I have some future TED Talkers in the room. Went over some style tips and tricks, and then talked about reflection and question asking and active listening as well. So I do want to give you all this space to ask me any questions that you have. So what questions do you have about the presentation today, or how you can incorporate this into your student organization meetings and events? Again, chat feature or just unmute yourself is totally fine. And this is where I'm practicing being comfortable with silence, right? So using my own tips and tricks. Any questions? Yeah. Absolutely. Well, hearing none, we will just move on to say thank you so much for coming this afternoon. Really appreciate your time and your effort that you put into your student organizations. So thank you for that. Like I said, my name is Alyssa. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the assistant director in the student engagement activities and leadership office. My email is there. Please feel free to email me anytime. My door is usually open unless I'm in a meeting or facilitating something. So please feel free to stop by as well if you know where the SEAL office is. I'm always happy to listen or to chat or answer any questions that you have. But if there are no other questions, y'all are free to go. I don't know, SEAL ambassadors, if there's anything else you need from the audience members, but that is it for me. I will stick around for a few moments if anybody would like to ask me a question just privately. But thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks, friends. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Hi, I have a quick question. I had to come in a little bit late. Who
No
do
problem.
I let them know that I was here? Is that you, or is that one of the SEAL ambassadors?
It is one of the SEAL ambassadors. I do notice that they logged off, but did you give them your student organization email or your personal? Because
I didn't yet. I was gonna ask them at the end. I came in like 15 minutes late. I had another class.
Anthony is still with us. Awesome. So I believe Anthony will need your like student organization email address.
Okay.
Anthony, correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, the entity email. Thank you. Perfect.
Great.
Thanks, Megan. That should be all we need. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.